welcome back everybody. We're going to take a look into, in this topic, we're going to take a look into the authentication proxy functionality of the iOS routers. And we're going to make a comparison between this and the dynamic ACLs, which are basically replaced by the authentication proxy functionality. Now, the dynamic access is also which are known as lock and key ACL. Had a restriction in that you cannot successfully control the traffic that was allowed per user, and also the authorization was not available to be downloadable from a remote server, like from a Radius or TACACS server. So the authorization of the user was basically locally configured. And also you could have configured a single authorization rule, which means a single ACL entry. So the scope of dynamic access was to basically first authenticate the user before was allowed access to the network. The authentication proxy functionality is more scalable because it can integrate with remote TACACS and Radius server, and it offers per user ACL authorization. So now with authentication proxy, what you can have is that once each user authenticates, each user can uniquely receive a different authorization from the remote AAS server, which again, this was not supported by downloadable ACLs. You can also do that not through a remote server, but you can do it locally. That's kind of a limited in functionality, means what kind of access these entries you can assign to the user after it's authenticated. In this topic, we're going to take a look, for example, in integrating the router authentication proxy with a remote Radius server, which are going to be the ACS. So now, the way authentication proxy works, and this is a restriction, is that we'll need to enable AAA, and you'll need to configure some AA lists. But the problem is that only default methods are supported. If we remember from the when we've done the TACACS authorization process on the router, the problem with defining, for example, a default login authentication list was that that was also applied to the console. So you may want to leave the console not authenticated, when we're going to see what are options to fix that problem. And the way you will implement it, for example, if we look at the diagram in here, what we want to do is that, let's say when switch 1 will want to initiate a session traffic in this direction, what we want to do is we want to enforce an inbound authentication proxy on R1's gig0 interface. So, for example, once R1 receives any kind of traffic from switch 1, I want to force that user, which would be switch 1, to first authenticate before being allowed access to the network. So, looking back at the slides now, the authentication proxy can be triggered only through HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, and Telnet traffic, which means that the user, which in my case would be switch 1, needs to first initiate some kind of one of these traffic types. Otherwise, it will not be prompted for authentication, so otherwise it will not be allowed access in the network. The authentication proxy functionality does not allow, so the iOS does not support something which is called the virtual telnet or virtual HTTP or virtual HTTP server, which means that the user will actually need to initiate the session towards the real destination. So, for example, in my case, it means that switch 1 will need to initiate the session to ICE1, so this would be my destination. And what will end up happening is that, based on my configuration, the router, which was R1, will intercept that session and it will force the user to authenticate. Once it successfully authenticates, then it will be granted access to the network based on the authorization received from the remote Radius or TACACS server. So we want to configure both the authentication lists and both the authorization list for the authentication proxy functionality. And if that's going to be successful, I'm going to receive the accesses from the Radius server. We're going to see what are the different options of receiving an access from the Radius server. We have multiple. And then the authorization will be applied inbound on the interface where the session was initiated intercepted in the first place. So now if we go back on the diagram just to make sure we follow on the same page. So again, what I want to do is I want to say that switch 1, this one will be my user. And switch 1 will initiate, let's say, a telnet session to ICE1. So this would be my telnet session. But I'm going to configure an inbound authentication proxy here on R1, which will say if basically if R1 receives some kind of telnet traffic, it will force that telnet session to be first authenticated, and then it will allow the user traffic to pass through based on the authorization received from the Radius server. So first we're going to configure the router side, and then we're going to go to the ACS and configure the integration with the router and the authorization attributes. So let's go on the route, which is on R1 in my case. And first of all, I need to again enable a new model. Then I need to enable a default. So as I said, authentication proxy works only with default list. I want to enable the default authentication list, which I want to do this by integrating it with the ACS server. So I'm going to first need to go and do that. So let's say AAA server, AA group server, and then radius, and give it a name ACS radius. I'm going to define it as server private 172.16.1.100 with a key of Cisco. And I'm going to say that the radius source interface would be loopback 0. And radius source interface loopback 0. And then I'm going to go and say A authentication, login, default, group ACS radius. And I also say A authorization, Auth Proxy, default, group ACS radius. Now, because I've configured the default authentication list, which now applies also to the router console, what I want to do is I want to configure a named authentication login list, which would be using no authentication, and apply that at the router console. So I'm going to say AA authentication login, and give it a name console, and I say none. And I'm going to say line console 0, and say authentication, let's say login authentication, and the name of the list would be console. So now if I exit on the router, it should not require me to authenticate, which it doesn't. Let's say show run section AA. So far I just enabled the configuration with the integration with the Radius server, and then I've configured the default authentication list to use the Radius server, and then the default authentication proxy authorization list to be integrated with the ACS Radius server. Next, what I want to do is basically, if I look back on the diagram, what I want to do is I want to say that as traffic is received inbound on R1, so in this direction in here, I want to say that I'm going to drop all traffic. So basically, no traffic will be allowed by the router inbound until it's authenticated. So I'm going to say I'm going to go on R1, and I'm going to define an access list, which is called IP access list extended, let's say, authentication, and I'm going to say deny IP any. First, let's go on R1 and say do show IP EIGRP neighbors. So I'm running EIGRP. Let me say 1 permit EIGRP any, so I don't lose my routing protocol adjacency. And then I'm going to go inbound on gig 00, and I'm going to say IP access group. The name was authentication inbound. So now I applied the inbound access list, which basically will drop all traffic. I want to go now and configure the authentication proxy rule, which let's say I want to use it only for telnet. So I want to intercept only telnet type of traffic as it passes through the router inbound on gig 00 interface and force that session to be authenticated. So I'm going to say IP authentication proxy and give it a name of, so let's say name authentication. And I'm going to do this only for the telnet protocol. I can, if you want, you can enable all of them. So you can configure the router to work for also FTP, HTTP, and telnet, or only, for example, for telnet, which is my case. So I'm going to say only telnet. And then I want to go in on the interface, which is same gig 00, and I want to say IP authentication proxy. And the name was authentication, and apply that. So looking at again on the interface gig 00, I have applied this inbound ACL which drops all traffic, and I also applied this authentication proxy rule, which means that I'm going to intercept transparently intercept all telnet sessions and force the users to first authenticate before being allowed access in the network. So let's say show IP authentication proxy, and then I can say configuration. So I have the authentication proxy name called authentication, which is used only for telnet type of traffic. Now I want to go on the ACS side. So let's go on ACS. And first what I want to do is I want to add R1 as a network device. So I'm using R1. Probably my ACS session timed out. I need to go and authenticate again. Let's say ACS admin. The problem is, if we look at the diagram, I'm trying to basically reach the ACS by initiating the session from test PCA, which is this one. And this basically all the inbound traffic is dropped by the ACL from R1. So let's go on the access list, which I've configured in here, show IP access list. And let's say conft IP access extended authentication. And I want to say entry 2, which says permit IP from VLAN 27, 136.1.27.0, 00.255 to any. So I want to allow the traffic from VLAN 27, which is the test PC VLAN. So let's try and connect again to the ACS now, which this time should be functional. Let's try and ping it. If I say ping 172.16.1.100, it works now. So I should be prompted with the ACS GUI to authenticate. We can also try and initiate a telnet session on port 443, 16.1.100 on port 443, which is successful. So let's go and say authenticate ACS admin, and then default 1A, login. So first I want to go and add R1 as a network access device into ACS configuration, which R1 was already added from previous tasks. I just want to also enable it now for radius, because it was enabled only for TACACS. So I'm going to say Cisco is the password, and then submit. And let's go and create another user in the internal user store, which I'm going to say create, and let's say the name it's Auth Proxy with a password of Cisco, and say submit. And now what I want to do is I want to go to policy elements, and I want to configure the network access authorization profiles. So let's say that I want to assign the authorization to a downloadable ACL first. So I'm going to go and create a downloadable ACL, which will be named Auth Proxy, and I'm going to say in here permit IP any. And I'm going to say submit. And let's go now to the access policies. By looking at the service selection rules, it says that whenever an inbound radius session is received, send that session to the default network access policy. So I want to go to the default network access policy. I want to make sure that the authentication is performed against the internal user store, which it is in my case. And then I go to the authorization rules, and I'm going to say create. I cannot specify anything based on the user. Let's go and let's say that I say customize. So I want to base my authorization rule against the user being authenticated. So I'm going to add system username. In here, I'm going to say OK, save changes. So now I can put the condition in my authorization rule to be based on the username. So I want to say that if the user being authenticated is Auth Proxy, then I want to select the authorization profile, which was I didn't yet configure. I just enabled the downloadable ACL. I still need to go, so I just configured the downloadable ACL, but I need to apply this to an authorization profile. So I have to go to Network Access Authorization Profiles, and let's say Create. I give it a name of Auth Proxy. And then under Common Tasks, I want to assign the DACL that I've configured previously, which is this one, and say Submit. So now I've configured the authorization profile. Now I need to apply it in the authorization policy. I'm going to say Create. Give it a name of Auth Proxy User. And then if the system username, so the user being authenticated is Auth Proxy, what I want to do is I want to apply the configured authorization profile, which was this one. OK, OK, and then save changes. So now at this moment, based on the config, what I say is that if I receive an inbound radius request and the username trying to authenticate is called Auth Proxy, then I will apply the respective authorization profile, which means I will send the downloadable ACL as part of the authorization profile, which means basically that I'm going to grant that user a permit IP any access to the network. So let's go on the router, and let's say again show run section AAA. And I have all this configured. At this moment is not going to work based on this config. Let's do this. Let's say debug radius authentication to better understand how the DACL works. So let's do this. And then let's go on switch one and initiate a telnet session to ICE1 to trigger the authentication proxy functionality. So I'm going to say telnet 172.16.3.100. So it says firewall authentication. This means that at this moment my configuration is correct. So basically I'm telneting to ICE1, but router 1 based on my config transparently intercepted the session. It forces me to authenticate before being allowed access to the network, and the authorization will be received from the ACS server. So now I want to say Auth Proxy, and the password was Cisco. This will never succeed because basically the telnet service is not enabled on ICE2. But let's go on R1 and let's say show IP Auth Proxy cache. So let's say show IP Auth Proxy cache. This should be it. It says that the client name was Auth Proxy. This was the IP address, and state is established, but I don't see any part of the authorization process. And this is because if we look at the debug in here, it says that I receive an access accept message from the radius server, which means that authentication was successful. And as part of that, I also received the DACL name, which I've configured. Now, the way DACL works is that within the access accept message, after successful authentication, the radius will send just the DACL name. If you look at this DACL, the access's name was actually called Auth Proxy. So this was the actual name of the DACL from the ACS. But you can see that the DACL that was received by the router has a longer name with a lot of random data, because this is supposed to be a unique one-time ACL name. Now, in order for the router now to actually request and accept the DACL entries, I want to go and say confd AAA authentication network AA authorization. Actually, this is an authorization, AA authorization network default group, and that would be ACS radius. So now once I've done this command, what it will mean is that the router will accept the DACL. At this moment, the router didn't even accept the DACL because it didn't have the authorization of network being configured. Whenever you receive an authorization from a radius server, you need the AA authorization network command to be configured. Now, additionally, the way DACL works is that once I get the DACL name from the radius server, what the router will do is it will initiate an authentication session with the username being the DACL name, which was this one, and the password of Cisco, basically asking for the DACL content. So by looking in here, I see that I didn't actually receive the access list entries which were defined on the ACS. I just received the DACL name. In order to allow the router to request download of the DACL entries, you need to configure the radius VSA radius server send. It's called, I think it's VSA. It is send radius should be radius server question mark. It's not this one. It's radius server. It's not available. Let me look at this one. Radius question mark. Radius server is the command, and then you want to say something which is VSA send authentication. So now once I've done this command, the router is now able to request the DACL content. Let's say clear IP authentication proxy cache all, and then let's go on switch 1 and initiate the session again. And again, I want to say Auth Proxy and the password of Cisco. Now if I look at router 1, and let's wait for it to finish the process in here, which it did. So again, I got an access accept message, which means that the authentication was successful. I received as part of the access accept message the DACL name. But now, because I also have configured the network authorization and the radius server VSA send authentication, then at this moment, as you can see, the router will send an authentication request to the ACS using the username of matching the DACL name and a known password of Cisco, but it says that event is ACL download. So basically, the router is actually now authenticating with the username of the DACL name and is requesting the DACL entries. That's why basically the access list, the DACL, it's unique, meaning it has a lot of random data in there because it's supposed to be one time used by the router to authenticate against the ACS server and request the DACL content. And now, once the router requested the DACL content, then it should also receive it from the radius server, which it did. So it received the permit IP any entry from the radius server. Now, if I go and see show IP Auth Proxy cache, let's see show IP Auth Proxy cache, and let's say username Auth Proxy. I see now that the DACL was correctly applied, basically. So the DACL entries were applied for the user session, which means, again, by looking in here, it means that the user is allowed permit IP any. If I say show IP access list, I should see, basically I see the DACL content which was downloaded from the Radius server. And now if I was initiating a new telnet session from switch 1, this now should work, but the problem is that the ICE doesn't have the telnet session, the telnet server enabled. Additionally, what I can do is I can go on the Radius server, and let's say that now I want to change the authorization, so policy elements, and say authorization profiles. I want to assign the accesses differently by using something which is called a filter ID ACL. And I say static. Now, the filter ID ACL, it works differently, meaning that, again, ACS will send to the router only the ACL name, but this time the ACL content needs to be locally configured on the router. And whatever name of the ACL I type in here, the same name needs to be configured as the ACL name on the router. So I'm going to say the value, let's say, is user2. Let's say user2. Before that, let's say this. So let's say clear IP authentication proxy star. Clear IP authentication proxy cache star. And let's go ahead and remove the, let's say, undebug all. And let's invalidate the config. Show run include VSA. So let's remove this functionality, which means that the router will not download the DACL content, so the configuration should not work. Copy paste. And then let's go on switch 1 and actually telnet to router 1, 150.1.1.1. Let's telnet to, so it basically, matches now the ACL entry, which means that traffic is not allowed. Let's say I want to telnet to 172.16.3.100 just to trigger the authentication proxy. So I said Auth Proxy. And then this would be Cisco. And now if I go on R1 and say show IP authentication proxy, username, IP authentication proxy cache, username Auth Proxy. Because the configuration is not valid, is it visible, the DACL is not available in the authentication proxy session. So this means that once this will time out, I cannot, for example, telnet to router 1. So the permit IP any DACL content was not applied. Now if you go back on R1 and say clear IP authentication proxy cache all, and let's trigger the session, let's put the command back. So let's validate the configuration, which was this one, which means now that the DACL content should be downloaded from the Radius server, and go back on switch 1, initiate the session to ICE and Auth Proxy and Cisco. Now if I go on R1 and I say show IP authentication proxy cache, username Auth Proxy, I should see the DACL content being applied, which it is. And now basically when this session times out, now I should be able to also telnet to router 1 because of the permit IP any received from the Radius server, which I do. Now basically the problem, why can't I telnet to the router itself to trigger the authentication process, is because the authentication proxy functionality does not support that. The router should only transparently capture the telnet, FTP, or HTTP traffic, but that traffic should not be destined to the router itself. That's a functionality that only the ASA supports, and that's going to be in another topic, but not the router. Additionally, because basically only these protocols are allowed, which means FTP, HTTP, and Telnet, it means that, for example, if the user first initiates like an RDP session or a SIP session, in order for that to work, because the router cannot intercept the RDP session or the SIP session to force the authentication, the user actually needs to first initiate a Telnet, FTP, or HTTPS session, or HTTP, authenticate to the router, and then initiate the RDP or the SIP session functionality.